Hi there, welcome to the Bonsai Stuff podcast. Scott Martin from Bonsai Matsu. I love your company. Thank you very much for listening in. This is part 2 of the Good Structure is Good Bonsai podcast. It was going to be a 2-part series, but I think I'm going to stretch it out to another one because there's so much and it can be a little overwhelming, the amount that gets talked about with this sort of stuff, and I think it deserves a little bit more time. So this one's going to be a shorter, punchier episode of the podcast, and I hope you enjoy it. And I hope you can get something out of it. And I just want to start the podcast by saying that you don't have to follow a series of rules. You know, guidelines are great, but they're meant to be broken. They don't always have to follow. So don't take what's talked about in this podcast and say, well, that's the Bible, that's what I've got to stick with. Of course, flexing those and working outside that framework can be really positive too. So anyway, let's get into it. All right, let's start talking about some good structural advice or rough guidelines. I don't like to be completely rigid with anything at all to do with anything design because it's all very personal, as you know, and it's more about what you want than what anyone else wants in this world when it comes to your bonsai. But these are some guidelines, I suppose, some tips and tricks, some things that I follow when I'm working to make the decision-making process a little bit easier when I'm working through trees. If I just keep this sort of stuff in the back of my head, when I get to a roadblock, when I get to a position where I can't decide what the next step is, I can think back to these good structural guidelines and think, well, this is what I want. I want to achieve good structure with my trees. I want to make them look beautiful without compromise. So therefore, there's got to be some kind of a pattern or not a path, not a set of rules, but just some thoughts that go in my head. And the first one I want to talk about is the rule of 1 to 2. If you ever get stuck, if you're ever looking at a clump of foliage, come back to 2 things at any one point, any one junction. So that means, the count the number of things that are happening in that one little area. If it's more than 2, if it's a trunk and 2 branches, well, that's 3 things. If it's, a branch coming off to ramification where you've got 3 or 5 things coming from the one spot, it's got to come back to 2. The reason why we do that is it avoids swelling. And it also makes the structure flow better and look less congested. Like I said, if no matter what tree it is that you're working with, deciduous or not, it makes zero difference to me. But when I work on the trees, I think about them having 0 foliage. Whether they do or whether they don't, doesn't matter. But that's the thought process for me. And when I look at it, I go, well, if this tree didn't have leaves on it, what would it look like in that area? And if it's a bunch of growth, a knuckle of growth that looks thick and congested now when it's young, when you first start looking at it, imagine what it's going to look like in 20 years. And it's how ugly and knobbly, and ultimately there's going to be so many nutrients flowing to that area along that branch that it's going to get so thick and coarse that ultimately it's going to be something you're going to look at removing in the future. So keep that guideline, keep that simple fact that you only want 2 things occurring at any one point. It doesn't have to happen right now, but it's definitely a target for you when you are working on your trees. And if you, like I said, if you do get stuck, if you look at it and go, looks wrong, looks too thick, looks too dense, what am I going to do about it? Come back to 2. What's the process? Just start by removing the ones that are the most incorrect, that are growing the wrong way. They're growing backwards, they're growing underneath, they're growing straight up. Whatever it is, just start eliminating the ones that are the least desirable in that area. If the branch is flowing out a certain way and then you find that the growth is opposite that direction, just start by getting rid of it. And you'll work your way down through the process of elimination to being left with 2 things, 2 branches, two structures of growth. Are they the best 2 that you possibly could have had? Maybe not, but I guarantee you won't look back on it and regret it. You'll look forward continually going, yep, okay, there's only 2 things in that area. Maybe a little bit of wire might be needed, but as long as you're left with the best of the bunch that are there, then it's a step forward for the tree. Another thing I look for when structural advice for you, or good structural advice, is flow consistency in the design. If the tree looks like it's sort of bending and twisting and heading a certain way, well then the flow of the tree is moving, let's say, towards the right-hand side, then keep that flow happening. Don't suddenly look at structure that's on, going to the left and make that dominant. Keep in mind when you sit back and look at that tree and put your feet up and get a feel for it before you start doing the work, go, okay, what's happening with this tree? It's sort of, okay, it's very neutral. It's right, then left, then right, then left, and it's sort of very static. Cool. Stick with it. If you want to change that, of course you can. But when you're working with the tree, keep your structure in mind that it's got to work with the flow and directional movement of the tree. And if it's conflicting with that, then look to change it. And if it's flowing, like I said, to the right, and you've got something strong out to the left, maybe don't think about spaghetting it round to the right hand side to fit with the flow of the tree. Maybe see if it can be reduced and compacted or manipulated. Of course, there are circumstances, there are trees that look beautiful that have all this stuff done on them, and I'm just trying to give you some kind of framework when you're working with your trees. Think about good branch placement when you're looking up the trunk of the tree. I'm definitely not talking about a spiral staircase. I'm not talking about left, right, back. That's the last thing that I want with your bonsai. But just think about when you're going through the branch selection process, if you put on your horticultural hat and think, okay, if that branch stays right there, what's the impact of it? Is it going to work? We've talked about the 1 to 2, so you don't want a bunch of branches coming from one area on the trunk, so you have to eliminate them down. And you want to make sure that the branch that you're keeping works with the flow of the tree, right? As we just talked about. So you've ticked those 2 boxes, then put on your horticultural hat and think, okay, the longevity of this branch, is it going to get the positioning, the sun, is it going to get what it needs to not only survive, but to thrive and become stronger and outlast time? It becomes something that becomes a permanent feature on the tree. Is that what's going to happen, or is it going to be shaded by something above it? Is it going to cause a key branch somewhere lower on the tree to get shaded, staying where it is? Is there a better option with all those other branches originating from one point on the trunk? Which is the best one of those? And again, you can start the elimination process. Okay, well, this one's growing completely wrong. It's on the same plane as the branch right above it. Okay, well, I don't need that one. And you don't have to look at them all and go, well, I just don't know. Just start by removing, maybe a couple that are completely incorrect, and then the decision becomes a bit clearer. And you might get left with, say three branches originating from sort of about the same spot. You look at the branches; they're all pretty much about the same, health, strength. They've got the same sort of foliage on them. Really, it could be any of the 3 that you've got left there. Flip a coin. Simple as that. Just work it back though. Keep that guideline of 1 to 2 in your mind. Keep the flow of the tree in mind, but then think about the branch placement and go, well, any of these 3 would be fine. Just pick one, but make sure that you're not being rigid with your design. Some of the most beautiful bonsai that grab your attention, that make you stop and have a look at them, don't follow that staircase model of trees. Some do. That may be exactly what you want. You want the staircase model with your branch placement. Perfect. You may want it. You may not want it. They're both correct. It makes zero difference to anybody in this world other than you as to what your bonsai looks like. But you've got to have the horticultural side of things to make sure that it's correct. So from a structural point of view, just make sure that you're choosing and you're selecting your branches that are going to be positioned correctly to thrive, to be in the best position to go forward and advance your bonsai and make them far better than what they are without it. While we're talking about branches, think about branch thickness as well. This always plays in the back of my head. From a good structural advice point of view, the thickness of your branch. The lowest branches should always be thicker than the upper branches. As the tree starts to grow into a little seed in life, pushes up, the first thing that starts to grow is the lowest branch. So therefore, that's the oldest part of the tree. The lower trunk and the first branch, pretty much, give or take, should be the oldest part on the tree in the real world. All right. So if you've got a thick apex and you've got thick, coarse branches at the top of the tree, which is very common for bonsai, then the lower branch will be, more often than not, the weakest branch on the tree. So when you're developing, when you're setting your structure, when you're looking through your tree and you're doing an assessment on it, sitting back, feet up, as I said, just looking at the tree, does it meet that requirement? Does it have that structural soundness that the lower branches are thicker, are more dominant, look older, are the most impressive branch effectively on the tree compared to the upper branches? And I say this and I stop myself all the time because it doesn't have to be like this. You can have a nice big thick branch up the top as part of your design that sort of comes down and really draws you in and makes you very interested. Of course you can. But overall, it should be that the lower branches are thicker, and definitely at the apex, it's got to be nice light structure. So that lower thickness, getting towards a lighter tape. I talked about taper last week, working the taper on your trunk, working taper on your branches, but also the thickness of your branches as you move up should scale down, thickest, medium, thickest in the middle section, and then the lightest at the top of the tree, because that's what I would expect to see when I look at a tree anywhere. That's how they grow. That's time. That's what's happened to them. Of course, they don't all meet that requirement, but as some sort of framework on what good structure is, that's something definitely that I look at. Position of the tree in the pot is critical from a structural point of view. So, if your placement is individual, it can be smack in the center of the pot and move, as I said earlier, to the right-hand side. No problem. It can flow to the right and be positioned to the left-hand side of the pot, so it exaggerates that movement to the right. And overall, the frame of the pot to the tree sort of balances itself out with that positioning of the left-hand side in the pot. But from a structural point of view, good structural point of view, you've got to ignore what's happening up on the tree and consider what's happening inside the pot. If you shuffle your tree too far, excessively to one side of the pot, then that's going to have an impact on the root system that can grow on that side of the pot. So let's say you shuffle it all the way to the left, the root system on the left-hand side will struggle. Absolutely will struggle. May look brilliant. Like from a design point of view, it might be the duck's nuts. It might be exactly what you want. Like that looks fantastic. It's really, it's a strong movement to the right. So I'm strongly pushing it to the left-hand side of the pot. Great. Design, no worries. Horticultural, is it the best thing for the tree? Is it structurally correct for the tree? No, it's not, because half of the root ball on that tree will be affected. So you'll find that the right-hand side of the base will get very strong and have a lot of room to grow. That left-hand side, as it pushes against the edge of the pot, will wrap around and start curling around to the right-hand side anyway. So I'd be seriously, if you wanted to move it, let's say, to the left-hand side of the pot, just make sure you've got enough of a gap in there. There's a reasonable to significant amount of space for that root system to grow, because that's far more important for me than the design side to look perfect. I'd always go horticultural over design perfection any day of the week. Any day of the week, because I know it's a long-term proposition doing that, as opposed to the short term where you're simply looking at what you get here and now, and that's that here and now that is sort of the last thing on my mind. So when we move onto the other parts of the tree and we think about the pad size to the tree, I've talked about this before too. This is some good structural advice that the pad size has to balance in with the trunk. And again, this is something which is talked about and repeated over and over and over by me, because I think it's super important. If you visual weight, the size, the the mass of foliage that you're looking at becomes overwhelming to the size of the trunk that you've got, then you need to adjust it. And your silhouette, that was my favorite word last week. When you look at the silhouette of the tree, you don't have to lose the silhouette of the tree to reduce the visual weight of the pads. Okay, so I'm not talking about taking a pad that's, let's say, I've got my hands up in front of my face. Let's say the pad's, 15 centimeters long, and it's one big pad. I'm not saying that when we work with this pad necessarily that we have to reduce that pad from 15 centimeters back to, say, 5 centimeters. What I'm saying is take the 15 centimeters, instead of being one pad, break it into 4 pads. So then you've got some space in there, negative space, that area where there's nothing. And all of a sudden, then you can start seeing the structure of the branch as well as the foliage. And it looks beautiful. It's such a more pleasing way to view your bonsai, seeing the foliage pads with some structure, then another foliage pad, bit more structure. It shows off the hard work. Foliage can hide the imperfections. Everything we're talking about with good structure, foliage can hide all that. You could have branches, growing backwards in towards the trunk of the tree that are quite thick and ugly, but they've got foliage on them. Cool, you can hide it away. But that visual weight of the foliage mass is something that you can't hide. That is going to be there in perpetuity until you do something about it. Either branch is going to get cut off, or you're going to start looking at lightening it up or opening it up and making more space in there. But that negative space and positive space, the two together, having something, then nothing, then something, then nothing, the two work beautifully together. So your silhouette can remain exactly as it is, but just bust it up a little bit more. Do the maintenance, clean it out, look at, as I talked about in previous podcasts, follow down the primary branch, look to your secondaries. Okay, can I make that an individual pad by itself? Just ask the question rather than going, okay, well, I've got, yeah, sure, I can see the primary branch coming out here. I've got this bunch of foliage in there and I've made this enormous 15 centimeter pad. It's like, okay, well, we want a 15 centimeter silhouette, but we want a pad that's going to be maybe 2 or 3 centimeters in length. And that's it. And then a bit of a gap, a couple of centimeters, a centimeter, then another pad, and then another gap, and then another pad. And so it's still going to have the overall view that you want, but it's just not going to have that mass where you look at it and go, geez, that looks heavy. That little trunk, that trunk that you've got, you've suddenly got all that massive foliage on it. It just looks so dense. And it's like, well, how does light get in there? How do things like the bud conveyor start to work when you've got all that massive foliage? And it just doesn't. Whereas you break it apart, you keep the same outside, the same silhouette of what you've got, but you open it up, get some space in there, let the light in there, let the air in there. You suddenly don't get fungal issues. You suddenly don't get pest issues. So horticulturally, you're ticking boxes left, right and centre saying, how good's this? New growth, there's budding coming from everywhere. So your bud conveyor is alive and well. And all of a sudden, you're taking steps forward with the tree, and it doesn't look heavy. Like from a design point of view, it all starts to work as well, where the tree comes together because you can see the trunk, and the trunk looks significant to the size of the pads. Anyway, that's another big one. The other one I want to talk about is trunk bend consistency, the distance between the two. That I don't want to ramble on too much with this podcast because I was originally thinking this would be a 2-part structure on two-part podcast on good structure, but there's a lot to it, and it can sort of get to the point where there'll be so much there that you'll start forgetting stuff. So I think I'm going to drag it out to a 3rd episode because there's still more that I want to talk about, and I'm hoping to be a bit more punchy with it rather than drawn out. So trunk bend distance consistency. So if, I've talked about it before, but it's really good structure. If you've got your bends as you go up the tree, in general, not always, but in general, they should be either about the same distance or start getting a bit smaller. So if your first bend's 10 centimeters, the next bend 9 or 8 centimeters, next one 5 or 6 centimeters, next one 3, and sort of you work your way down, and it starts to look more compact and works with the taper of the tree. Of course, it doesn't have to always be like that, but that's something that when I'm working with a tree that's got maybe it misses that bend. The first one's 10, the next one might be 25, and then it comes back again. Of course, you can make it work, but it's something that when I'm working with younger trees and working to a point in the future, that I'll definitely take that into consideration. Branch angle consistency, massive one. If your branches are bending at 45 degrees, keep them all bending at 45. Don't have, some horizontal, some at 45, some, maybe shooting upwards. Try and get it where they're all working and feeling the same way. I'm going to jump over that because I've talked about it before, but the other one I want to talk about is the branch origin angle from the trunk, where the branch as it comes out from the trunk, if you talk about a left and right looking out from the trunk of that branch, I sort of reckon you've got about 30 degrees that you can naturally move that branch. Of course, it can be different, but I would stick within a 30-degree angle of that branch coming out of the trunk. Anyway, there's some good points I think that I work with consistently when I'm thinking good structural for my bonsai, and hopefully it's been of help to you too. Well, thanks, folks. That's it. We start to wrap up the podcast. As I said, it's a bit shorter, this podcast, because I want it to be impactful. I want it to have meaning and be something that you can maybe look at things with a fresh set of eyes. Again, I'll wrap it up by saying they're not hard and fast rules, and please don't think that you have to have serious structure when you work with your bonsai. It's a medium that can tell a million tales, and as long as it puts a smile on your dial, none of it matters. The horticultural stuff's the most important for longevity of your trees. That's always got to take first and foremost. But the design stuff, that's up to you. So please don't think that this is something that you have to follow. Otherwise, get out. You're not part of the club. It doesn't work that way. So hopefully you've enjoyed the podcast. Thanks for listening in. As always, I want to give a shout out to the supporters of the podcast, because you're the lifeblood, and I know that means a lot. So thank you very much. I'll be back next week drumming on about good structure is good bonsai again. So until then, as always, happy bonsai.